Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Will Tanner, co-founder of the American Tribune. And as per on X, a tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. Will, thank you very much for taking time to have a chat today.
Thanks for having me on. Been looking forward to it.
We were just saying off air that there's so many different potential directions that we could take this conversation. And I think maybe the easiest place to start is to ask you for your views of what's going on in the world at the moment and how can we even start to try and make sense of the plethora of things that are happening.
Yeah, obviously it's a big question. My general framework for looking at it, and I have no idea where a lot of these things will head, like Israel, America, and Iran, or China and Taiwan. But my general framework is that things are coming to a head with a couple long-running crises, and people are on the clock for it. The best example is the demographic crisis. Like China with the one-child policy and the birth rates, it's going to have trouble doing something like invading Taiwan in another generation or two in a way that it might not now. Or Russia retaking the Ukraine in a generation or two would be much more difficult because of demographics than it is now. So they kind of have to go for it. The same is true of Israel and Iran, where support for Israel is very much falling in America because younger people don't care in the way that older people do. So this is really Israel's last shot to try and deal with it in a way that America might support them. So I think things like that, where people are on the clock, or countries and interests are on the clock, are very much what's coming to a head right now. The other example, of course, would be the debt crisis, where it's been building and building and building for so long, and you know, what the straw that breaks the camel's back in, I have no idea, but I do think we're getting closer, and that's why you see things like the Europeans being so invested in the Ukraine war because they want to recapitalize some of their debts and assets with seized assets in Russia and or Ukraine. I just think things like that are really what's going on, and why so many things seem to be breaking out at once is because, the clock is running out and people want to at least try before time's up.
Yeah, as you just highlighted there, it's not just the US, it's certainly in Europe as well. And I know that we have not an agenda, but we have to be clear and realistic in what we're saying. And what I mean by that is that all we have to do is, I know you're a very astute studier of history as well. We'll go into that a bit later on. But when you talk about debt and you talk about, finding a way out of that debt, 9 times out of 10, that does normally mean war. It's not pleasant to
Hmm.
say, but history has
Hmm.
shown that that's the case, and it's just repeating or rhyming at the moment.
Absolutely. And there are certain conditions in the past where people got out of these things without there being some, cataclysmic blow up. The best example, or at least most relevant, would be Britain after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where, after the Seven Years' War, then the American Revolution, then Napoleon, all happening in a string. I think debt to GDP was around 250%, and about half of the budget was taken up and just paying the interest on it, which was, of course, quite a lot. And somewhat more as a percentage than now. But the difference was they didn't have these millstones around their neck, namely entitlements, or in Britain now, the NHS. In America is in a very similar spot. So, yes, they were able to just grow out of it because the Industrial Revolution happened and the Agricultural Revolution happened, and they found a huge amount of gold in South Africa. It's somewhat unclear if any of those non-war things would happen today, and I somewhat doubt it.
Yes, I doubt we'll ever really know if we're trying to piece back, what's happened before us. But you
Hmm.
mentioned there South Africa, and I wrote a few pieces a while ago with, that influx of gold, Australia as well, actually, and
Hmm.
how that really helped shape the gold standard and Britain and its colonies in the 19th century. And I find that's a fascinating subject and a lot to talk about there.
Oh, absolutely. Really. like it for as an American in American history, William Jennings Bryan and McKinley fighting in the late 19th century over bimetallism versus the gold standard was very much America's big populist blow up that almost happened, but was really only averted because of the Rand mines and then because we found gold in Alaska as well that helped out a good bit. So you look at these chance occurrences that averted what could have been disaster, like uh, the Cross of Gold speech and that whole movement was very much a proto-socialist movement, and America was fortunately able to dodge it for the next 40 years until FDR, really just because these mines were functional. It really shaped how things went, which I think is important to remember that we kind of stumbled out of that crisis rather than figuring our way out of it, I guess.
I love how the theme so far is energy and commodities and so forth, and it seems like again that's played its part over hundreds and hundreds of years, and I imagine what it is playing its part today. I imagine that's also going to play its part moving forwards as well. It's almost as like the narrative will never change. People think that the narrative is changing.
It's interesting because on one hand, I think that's quite right, but on the other, we have these weird ideological just problems now, like really an albatross around our neck. For example, is the Green Movement, where if you looked at, say, America or England in 1880, and they had invented nuclear power, just assuming, all that was possible,
Mhm.
they would have adopted it fully. There'd be a nuclear reactor in every county in America, every village in England, and there'd just be cheap, free, or essentially free electricity. Whereas now, just because of these weird things and our inability to look into the future and want to invest now and figure it out, we're still using like coal for electricity or building these idiotic solar fields that cover up farmland. And it's entirely unnecessary. We could just build the nuclear plants, and our ancestors from not that long ago would have built the nuclear plants, but now we just can't do it or can't bring ourselves to do it, really, which I think is a somewhat different problem than the more material constraints rather than ideological constraints of a century ago and before.
I read somewhere a while ago that as it I forget what I'm just about to say. The small modular reactors. I read a while ago that they'd actually been produced or had everything ready for them to go in the 60s. But I believe because of different maybe political disagreements at the time, they actually never got given the mainstream go ahead. So even we're talking about going back 100 years, could even go back about 50 years. And again, if
Mhm.
the right things were in the right place or, whatever happened then we could be, sitting here in a completely different, world or completely different energy environment nowadays.
Absolutely. It just is evidence for that. The US Navy's nuclear powered aircraft carriers and nuclear powered submarines. Of course, you have to train people and it's dangerous in some ways, but we've had the technology to do this stuff for a long time. Just, I guess, kind of since the 50s, we've been unwilling to do it or unwilling to make those investments and figure out how to make it work because of the ideological conditions. It's not only the green stuff, but it's also very difficult to have a nuclear power plant if the hiring is affected by disparate impact policies where you're uh, forbidden by law from hiring the most qualified people because doing so would be racist. I guess you can't really have nuclear power in that scenario, so it makes sense. But it's just it's frustrating because our ancestors, I think, were much better about being practical and doing the things they should do, and now we don't. And energy is a great example of it.
Well, I also think that we're almost a bit soft, I think, nowadays as a society. And you just hit the nail on
Mhm.
the head there. Employ the best person for the job. That's quite simple. I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah, a lot's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, should we say, that I think's helped, shape where we are nowadays. But hiring the best person for the job, I've always, been told it's simple to do. And if they all happen to be of one gender or one race, then so be it. If they are the best people for the job, then happy days. What's the problem?
Yeah, I agree. The problem is some of these things have to be done at scale, like Chevron, for example. You really can't have like a large oil company that's just run with a few people. You need a lot of people. You need the scientists, you need the engineers, you need the people running the fields. But companies that large, they really have to abide by the Civil Rights Act and all the insane rulings related to it in a way that smaller companies don't. So you get these distortions where, theoretically we could be doing all these things so much better, but we don't really because it's illegal in these insane ways where Chevron, as they try and pump oil out of the ocean, instead of thinking about doing that, they're thinking about like how to put a black woman on the oil rig. And it's just insane. Like if she was good at the job, then great, but they shouldn't be thinking about how to, fit the square into the circle on the little kid's like toy. It's just it doesn't work. And I think that's one of the things that's coming to a head as we're getting this entirely unnecessary competence crisis as the whole diversity thing comes to a head.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of a lot of there's a lot of things, a lot of headwinds or tailwinds, however you want to describe it, happening at the moment. That I know that between this episode going out, I've written a two-part series with Uranium Investor, and we're speaking about uh, the not the odds, that's not the way to put it, but the fact that the UK itself is heading towards a civil war. And I know that our mutual friend Ian Burlingame has said a very similar thing, that he expects that to happen in due course. And I think that, whether we admit it or hide it under the carpet, we're talking race, we're talking religion, we're talking a whole multitude of factors. And it's probably not just the UK.
Mhm.
We could be seeing this movement, for want of a better word, happening around the world, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, it's harder to quantify because it's not as just easy like a factor as race and sex or religion and stuff. But like the people who think that, really the people with high agency are what should be preferred by society. Like the mindset that you got in Europe during the Belle Epoque, where if you wanted to do something, really you could do it. And same in America in the period, versus the kind of post World War II and to a lesser extent post World War One circumstance where that's not the case, and it is the low agency people who are held up above all else, where no, those who succeed are going to be taxed to pay for you to sit around or to pay for you to do drugs or to pay for you to just
Mm.
like defraud people. Those are very different societies, and I think that's another split that, particularly inside the right, is happening as you get like the retiree crowd that thinks younger people should pay their pensions versus the younger people who just don't want to do that. And then, all the splits resulting from it where I really think that is a huge split and it plays out like in the diversity stuff where no, the like low agency diverse people should get the job just because of that. Or no, we need to tax the rich, tax the high agency to pay for people who never want to do anything. I think that's another big split that might not be the reason for the Civil War or the disorder you mentioned, but is heightening tensions as the people who can do things just drop out because they don't want to do them or find a way to do them in a way that doesn't help the existing regime.
Reminds me of the recent Canadian election. There was I think it's a famous meme of this baby boomer who was literally just sticking his middle fingers up to the camera because I think he was off to vote for Carney. So I think, as you highlight, there's quite a big disparity between those two generations, and as you said, we're seeing fraction or factions, sorry, being created as a result.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things where it's not quite a left-right split. Because some of the tech guys, for example, in America, were kind of on the left and now kind of aren't. Whereas a lot of retirees like are traditionally kind of on the right, but now really aren't. Yeah, it's just it's a weird circumstance, but I think it's a huge problem. It's one of those headwinds that makes it hard to do anything, where those who would do things are just taxed to the point where it's not worth doing. To speak of the UK, I've just recently, by chance, been watching the new season of Clarkson's Farm, and it's one of those things where it's infuriating because every time he wants to invest money in the community and do something, there's some idiotic retired council member who's stopping him from doing it or taking it. It's infuriating, and I think when you have that happening on a continental scale, as you do in America or in Africa or in Europe, it's just, well, of course nothing happens because it's been forbidden. So yeah.
Red tape, and more red tape, and a bit more bureaucracy. I think that seems to be the answer for quite a lot of things at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about everything that's happening at the moment. And again, you eloquently, write about this on the American Tribune as well, and also on your X feed. Just looking at a couple of stories, on your X feed, we've got these two Chinese scientists that, look to, destroy the wheat crop in the USA. So that obviously that's not good. We've then got, a lot of things happening in Europe. Is it the end of tyranny? What happened here? What happened there? Obviously, we've got Israel and Iran as well. Is there anything? Oh, and then of course Enoch Powell and his very famous speech back in 1968. There's so many different things that we could talk about. But is there anything on your mind at the moment that you think actually, I want to talk about and people need to know about, whether it's things that's coming down the road, things that are happening behind the scenes, anything like that?
Yeah, one thing is you mentioned the Chinese scientists and the wheat blight they brought into America. I think there's a tendency on the right generally to assume that because we have domestic enemies that are so terrible and or domestic enemies are terrible, that means we don't have foreign enemies. It means like the Chinese are the good guys or the Iranians are the good guys. And I very much don't think that's the case. Like, I don't think we should go to war with Iran. I have no desire to do that. I'm not a warmonger of any sort, but I think it's important to remember that, for example, the Chinese are very much our enemies. Ever since the 90s, they've been discussing openly this unrestricted warfare strategy where whatever action they take is really meant to weaken the other side in some way. So when they have subsidized trade where they're, putting American steel makers out of business as they make steel themselves, or putting Canadian aluminum makers out of business as they make aluminum themselves, it's not because they want an efficient marketplace. It's because they want to destroy the other side's ability to do things. And agriculture is a very undercounted aspect of modern economies, really ever since like the 1870s and the agricultural depression in Britain, it has been. But I think that's wrong because we we all need to eat. And if the Chinese had managed to get the wheat blight, the genetically modified wheat blight they had brought into Michigan into the fields, that could have taken out a significant percentage of the world's wheat production because what America grows wheat-wise is really grown in the upper Midwest. And that would have been a disaster. And they were obviously trying to do that. The people who did it were CCP agents or connected in the CCP, I mean, and they were going to Michigan to spread wheat blight. It's insane. And they've already done this to American crops. The emerald ash borer is a bug that suspiciously showed up in America on a stone shipment. Where it looks like it was placed there, because what else would the bugs have been doing in there? And it has destroyed hundreds of millions of elm trees in America. Similarly, the Asian psyllid is a little bug, and it carries a bacteria called HLB. I think the Chinese name is like Huanlongbing or is some word I'm unable to pronounce. And that has destroyed 95% of orange production in Florida. Where if you know anything about Florida oranges, like those used to be the gold standard of oranges, and America grew them and produced hundreds of millions of crates, 90-pound crates of oranges as late as the 90s. And then this bacteria on a bug from China, where it had only ever been seen in China before, mysteriously showed up. And now America is really unable to produce citrus fruit in large quantities, particularly oranges. It's completely decimated it. So I think while we have to think about our domestic enemies and deal with them, we should also remember that these people abroad do hate us, and we very much need to keep that in mind and prevent them from doing so in whatever ways we can.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And again, the only reason I was alerted to it was on your X feed. It'd be interesting to know how many people watching or listening to this would have had any idea of what's happened and again what might happen moving forwards. Very strange. Yeah, very strange. I think warfare can take on all sorts of different ideas. It could be obviously, physical war. We could have cyber war now, or in this case,
Mhm.
crop war, which again, I don't think a lot of people would necessarily think about that. But if you're going to take down a country and take down people and take down produce, actually, it's probably a decent way to do it.
Oh, absolutely. And if you don't believe me, go to your local grocery store, not you specifically, but just people listening, and see if you can find Florida oranges in the store for a reasonable price. My guess is you can't. There's Natalie's orange juice that sells for like $8 for a couple cup, like small bottle now. And you'll very rarely see some like specialized navel oranges from Florida in the store. Other than that, it's nearly entirely Mexican oranges. And that's because Florida's orange crop has been obliterated by this Chinese bacteria that I think was imported here intentionally. And there's a good bit of evidence in terms of what the Chinese were saying at the time that it appeared that indicates that. So again, I don't want to go to war with China. I'm not a warmonger, but I think we need to be very prudent about like trade policies and watching and paying attention to what's going on because they do hate us and they do want to destroy us. They see us as partially responsible for the Opium War, which is insane because America was like barely moving beyond the Atlantic at that point, not dealing opium in China. But they do, and they want to destroy us. So like fentanyl is another example. About 100,000 Americans die every year from fentanyl, which is more than died in the Pacific Theater in World War II, or about the same amount. And 90% of the fentanyl precursors go to Mexico from China and are shipped to the cartels specifically from China. And we know the Chinese could clamp down on it at any time if they wanted to, but they very much don't want to because they like seeing the damage wrought in America by it. So I find it insane that we're still trading with them or still treating them as a valuable like trade partner and partner in the world generally because they're not. They hate us. They want to destroy us, and that needs to be considered. It needs to be remembered, and it needs to affect our policies towards them.
All of that being said, then, do you think that Trump and his administration, the idea of make America great again and bringing home all that manufacturing, do you think him and his entourage can see pretty much everything you've just said, and that's their solution for it is to bring everything back behind closed doors, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's very mixed. I think on one hand, there are people kind of in the orbit of the administration. Eric Prince, the former leader of Blackwater, founder of it, is probably the best example on that front, where he's very attuned to what the Chinese are doing in America in the common sense ways to push back on it without just like radical, bomb the Three Gorges Dam style nonsense. Which I love the memes, but of course we're not going to do that. I think Trump himself, he's very much a devotee of President McKinley, at least to the extent that like he knows what McKinley did. And McKinley is best known for using tariffs to reshore and really just shore up American industry. Where if you look at what was going on in the period, about like 90% ish of what our factories, mines, et cetera, produced was consumed domestically, which create because of tariffs keeping stuff out, at least to the point of making domestic production profitable, to the point where there's this continuing virtuous cycle of investment, sales, reinvestment that turned America from like a kind of middling agrarian republic on a large scale into a behemoth that was able to compete with not just one country in Europe, but the entirety of Europe. And I dislike what we've done to the Europeans, but I think it was important that really that like 1890s investment boom and the manufacturing boom that came from it is what turned America into what it was. And Trump wants to recreate that by bringing factories here, bringing the tens of billions of dollars in investment here and all the jobs that come from it. That might succeed, but I don't know if it's as intentional about dealing with the Chinese because of these things they've done to America as it could be. But regardless, it's certainly much better than like NAFTA and all that stuff that was being done before Trump. It's certainly an improvement, and I don't mean to diminish it. I just don't know. I think he would prefer to strike a deal with the Chinese than to just exclude China entirely. And I think the more reasonable response would be moving towards a situation in which we are entirely untangled from China.
Fair enough. I say I ask that just from a British perspective to be more of a curious question and
Mhm.
trying to get anything else out of that. I know we were saying off air that you specialize in British colonial history and things a bit more in the past. So let's go back a little bit then. You actually mentioned the Opium Wars, and in my mind, that's Britain and China. Didn't really have any idea that the USA were involved, were not involved. Maybe let's start with the Opium Wars and let's see where that conversation takes us with regards to British colonial history and all the things that are going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I could be incorrect, but my understanding is that America was uninvolved in pretty much every way with the Opium Wars, but that the current Chinese government sees America because it's an Anglo nation as being like partially responsible for it. And then that's why the fentanyl is really showing up exclusively in America and Britain is because of their hatreds over the Opium Wars. At least that's what I've seen and read on the subject. But to go to that history, I think that's really interesting because if you look at like pre-Napoleonic, purely mercantilist colonial history, and then the like imperialism we think of with the 19th century, the Opium Wars were really the middle area, though they came somewhat after Napoleon, where you, on one hand, have this like desire to trade with other countries that's somewhat different than the mercantilist era. But on the other hand, you have them like destroying the Chinese fleet and selling
Mm.
opium so that they can hoover up silver that then they can use for further trade purposes. So it's really interesting as a middle ground. And there's some evidence that the silver that they were able to garner by selling the opium in China kept the imperial project alive and pushed it to the point where then you get the explosion in imperialism of the 19th century that I think really helped the still developing world. For example, one of my favorite colonial figures, and I'm working on a long form thing on him now, is James
Mhm.
Brooke, the White Raja of Sarawak. Conrad based Lord Jim on him, where he he worked for the East India Company, got wounded, eventually just decided to take over part of Indonesia and became essentially a princeling, and his family owned part of Indonesia until after World War II. But he was only over there because of this increasingly flourishing and profitable trade with the Orient, particularly China, that came out of the Opium Wars. So, um, though it's understandable that China is upset that the British were selling them opium and kind of
Mm.
pushing these opium dens along when the king emperors were interested in shutting it down, I think it very much helped the colonial project and kept it alive so that you got this blossoming of it in the decades after.
Just one point to go back with. You mentioned about the the British going in the Opium Wars and hoovering up all the silver. Well, that would have been very irksome for the Chinese because I believe they were still on a silver standard at the time. So their main form of currency or money in that case has actually been taken away by a foreign entity. So yeah, it's no wonder that they're going to be cheesed off by that. What I'll do for people watching the video or listening to the podcast, if you go to the Substack or YouTube, I'll put a link to the Opium Wars in the post because very interesting reading is probably the best way to
Mhm.
describe it. Um, that being said, okay, so you're writing a long piece, at the moment, and again, I'm just trying to think of, if I know Britain's done a lot of bad things, and I know that you've highlighted as well. I think we both saw the same story recently where there was a country estate, I think that's actually been closed
Mhm.
down, or due to various reasons that I'd like you to go into, has closed down. Uh, Give us a bit more information about that and why that signals that things are definitely changing.
Yeah, so if you want to look up the estate, it's the Bridehead Estate, and
Okay.
the listing, at least when I checked a week ago, was still up on Country Life from before it was bought. Where for about $40 million, they were selling this classic country manor home. It wasn't really a stately home in the way that like Highclere or Chatsworth are, but it's a beautiful stone mansion home in the countryside along with a couple villages that were still owned by the family and a few thousand acres of agricultural farms, mainly, and woods and the like. That the family had held, from what I remember, at least since the Tudors, kind of in that dissolution of the monasteries stage of country estate accumulation. So I don't think it was a Norman family, but it was an old family that had held it for centuries. And they just got tired of dealing with it and sold it off, which is a common theme. It was more common in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when you had the 90% death taxes that just eviscerated an
Um,
ability to hold anything. But it's kind of come back up in a different way in that death taxes are 40% now, which is high, but you can still do things. Like the Grosvenors have kept their family fortune intact, as have the Percys. If you want to, you can at this point, is really the state of things in Britain. Sadly, people don't want to. You have these old families. There was another one, I forget the name. It was a castle. It wasn't even a manor home. It was like a castle that the family has held for close to a millennium, and they sold it because they were tired of dealing with it. And you just get this where there's whether because it's low birth rates, meaning people don't have grandkids they care about, or whether they don't want to have grandkids even because they don't care about what's going on. they're just selling off these beautiful homes and the estates around them that have been accumulated over centuries and held over centuries because that's what made the family someone. And they're just selling it off. And I think it's quite sad, not only in that the family doesn't hold it, but that if you look at who these people were, it's not that like the 40 million pound capital value of the Bridehead estate was that
Mm.
notable. I mean, that's a lot of money. I'd love to have a $40 million estate, but you have richer people all over the place. It's that by holding that, they were somebody in the way that you're not somebody if you have 40 million pounds and common stock in Apple or whatever. You're just not the same sort of thing. And so you have this total destruction and diminishment of family power rooted in an area that in different years would have been the basis for pushback on these tyrannical government policies. Like to go way back, you have the barons' revolts of the Plantagenet years, where the old English barons, really barons rather than earls, would think the king was going too far. Either taxes were too high, or he was bringing in too many foreigners, or if something's going on where they're going to push back. And their ability to push back on it, whether via political maneuvering or armed force, was rooted in the countryside. And that continued for a very long time. Not only the English Civil War, which of course is useful to look at, but as late as 1910, when you have the fight over the Parliament Bill in Parliament, where Churchill had introduced the People's Budget, which raised death taxes and income taxes in peacetime tremendously. The Lords struck that down. And then to prevent the Lords from being able to strike it down, Lloyd George, Churchill's friend, introduced the Parliament Bill, which removed the power of the Lords to veto financial legislation and cut their veto power to 2 years, where something could still be passed after the 2 year mark. The Lords tried to fight against that, particularly Bender, the second Duke of Westminster, and Lord Willoughby de Broke led this faction in the Lords called the Diehards that were going to try and strike that down, even if the king was going to create new peers to make it possible. And this is forgotten, but it is true. They were not only pushing back in Parliament, but they were organizing and starting to think about mobilizing the country yeoman units that they controlled as lords. Because part of their position wasn't just being wealthy and being in the House of Lords, it was also controlling these county level militias, riflemen particularly, that were loyal to them because they lived in the countryside. They farmed these estates. They had tenants that they'd had for hundreds of years, and there was mutual bonds there. Or had they wanted to, it's not inconceivable that they could have actually raised these militias and marched on London. Now, they decided not to, perhaps mistakenly, but they could have done it and they considered doing it. And they were only able to be in that position because of all the ties that bind that were created by these long-head estates and prudent management of them, particularly in terms of dealing well with tenants and having people who are loyal to you. If you look at what happens when they're sold and handed to BlackRock or some sheik who's just living in England temporarily, it's not the same. You don't have any of that, even if you're nominally more wealthy or have an income stream that's easier to deal with. So you have this just destruction of any ability to resist an increasingly tyrannical government. And I think that's really a shame. It's an abdication of duty because it's not just that these people are supposed to be wealthy. That's kind of been the consideration since World War II-ish, but they're supposed to have a duty to the people of the countryside that they are lords over. And I think when you see the selling of the estates, you really see the end of the line on that and the abdication of that duty. And I find it quite sad.
Never really thought about it like that before. Having a modern day lord or lady still having a duty over, their immediate surroundings. I've never put two and two together on that level before. So thank you for expanding on that. What else has also been happening? Again, is there anything else on top of that, what you've just explained, that we're trying to fight, tyrannical governments and so forth? People are getting tired, birth rates are decreasing as well. Is there anything else that you think is a contributing factor to the general, not downfall of society? I don't want to be clickbaity, but the general, disintegration of society as we know it at the moment.
Absolutely. Remind me to follow up in terms of looking at this through the African post-colonial experience in a
Mhm.
minute. But just to stick with Britain and kind of
Mhm.
America and the Anglosphere before I do that, if you look at like what was the case before World War I, even after the agricultural depression had started shaking things up, You had this rule by Gentry or people like the Gentry that I think was quite beneficial. This was the case in America. There's a great book called The Age of Federalism that describes this through the lens of Virginia, which is probably the most like England of any of the American colonies. But it was the same in New York. It was the same in South Carolina, where the men who made decisions were in a position to make decisions because they were trained to do so from birth, essentially, and because their position of prominence led people to be loyal to them if they deserved it. So you have Wade Hampton III, who was a general in the Confederate side in the Civil War, who, as war was breaking out, instead of just volunteering, as a lot of people did, he raised the Hampton Legion, which was a few thousand men that he armed out of pocket, trained out of pocket, and led because they wanted him to lead them rather than some officer assigned to that by the Confederate government. And that's an edge case. A few people did that. But it is the vibe you get of men like that. George Washington is another great example where people wanted to follow him, but he was only in a position to be followed because of his family's ties to the area and his willingness to then build on that. Not only in terms of wealth and keeping the wealth intact, but in terms of, serving in the militia, learning how to lead people, doing a good job of it, working with the tenants, working with the people in the area. He was quite good at that. And those are just two examples. I won't keep rattling off more. But there are a lot of men of the period who are like that. And they weren't only wealthy. They didn't just have political power, but people were loyal to them and they were embedded in their community, like I was describing with the estates. And I think that created a very different form of governance in that, if you're a member of parliament because your people elected you rather than because you like goaded a bunch of pensioners into casting a ballot for you, you're going to have to like live by the regulations you enact, the taxes you enact. And so you're not really going to want to do anything that makes that worse. You're not going to want to pass like the county level regulations that make Jeremy Clarkson's life impossible right now. You're not going to want to foist 90% death taxes on yourself because then your son won't be in the same position you're in. You're just not going to do any of that. And then that leads into foreign policy where you're not going to embroil yourselves in these ridiculous situations where suddenly any of this seems like a good idea. And, that creates these mutual bonds where people will elect you because they trust your judgment on that issue because you've shown that they can trust your judgment on that issue. And that is a somewhat flowery telling of it. Not everyone lived up to that, but I do think that was really the basis of rule by the gentry that lasted from, say the Tudors kind of overthrowing the Plantagenet order that was quite different to World War One-ish, where all of this just died because everyone involved with it died. I think it was like 20% or 25% of the old Etonian families died in World War One, which was over double the death rate of the common soldier. It was just a massacre of them. And then the death tax instituted to pay for the war eviscerated their estates after they died fighting for their country. So their rule was really ended in this World War One period. And what you get after that is managerialism and rule by bureaucrats. And that had been happening to some extent before the war, of course. The Parliament Bill is one example of it. But it really became a lot worse in England. And then with FDR, America became a whole new place under FDR. It was very much different before and after him. And at that point, it's no longer these members of the gentry, and to a lesser extent in England, the peerage, but that was always such a small group. Really, it was the gentry who was doing things. It's instead these bureaucrats who they're not elected to their position by people who rely on them. They're appointed to it by some other commissar in the government because they're going to be loyal to the ostensible ideological goals of the government, which was increasingly socialistic at the time. And their perspective is, because of that, entirely different. They're not worried about living by the taxes and regulations they enact. They'll include some loophole to get out of them or just try and foist
Mhm.
them on other people. Instead, they want to expand their department, expand their, tiny little principality inside the government so that they can remain a position of influence, a position of power that they wouldn't have otherwise because they're always just sniveling mediocrities. And so that's what you get with this just explosion in bureaucratic power in corporate life and in government life after World War One, where you you no longer have like titans of industry like Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan ruling their businesses like empires. You might get a couple like Elon Musk, but it's very rare. Instead, you get these just organizations where the organization is the point. And that's the truth of government. It's what happened to companies. And that's just this explosion in control by people who have no stake in the game. They're not involved. It's not like they're, using their estate as a basis for helping run the country in the way they think it ought to be run. They're just trying to hoover up power and, tax people to make that continue. It's entirely different. And I think that's really something we've seen become a lot worse in the Anglosphere, where if you look at why civilization is degrading, it's quite literally because the men who built civilization are no longer in charge. Like people talk about, oh, where did the beautiful buildings go? Why does London not look like Mayfair and Belgravia anymore? Well, it's because the Westminsters quite literally built Mayfair and Belgravia and made it beautiful because that was their taste. And now they still own it, so it's nice. But the rest of London, which used to be owned by similar families, was taxed, and now Blackstone or BlackRock owns it, and they filled it with Arabs, and it's hellish. So, like, that's why these things have gone the way they've gone, is because policy has quite literally made it so, particularly the bureaucratic element in society. And I think that's what's happened inside Britain, particularly, and then also inside America. Though, if you're okay with me just continuing with the Africa thing I was mentioning earlier, I hate to ramble, but just to tie it together,
Hmm.
if you look at the post-colonial order, you don't really have the bureaucratic element in the same way. Like yes, you have the UN, yes, you have the US government that's controlled by bureaucrats doing these things, but it's not that like Zimbabwe became Zimbabwe because of an internal bureaucracy. It's you get this race communism inflicted upon the post-colonial order because both the Soviets and the Americans after World War II saw it as their basis of future power and to a lesser extent their duty to eviscerate the old colonial order and replace it with something egalitarian. That was really the tie that binded America and the Soviet Union and China, of course, where it's not that like Rhodesia was unfunctional and that's why it had to be destroyed. It's not that people were starving; they weren't. It was quite prosperous. It's that it was considered racist for a white minority to rule on the basis of landed voting. It wasn't even apartheid. It was just, well, you have to have some amount of property in Rhodesia to vote in Rhodesia. And that was described as racist or, whatever. So it was destroyed and you get this, Mugabe regime. And if you
Hmm.
look at, why did the Soviet Union and America become allies to destroy Rhodesia? It's that they had quibbles over what sort of government should replace the colonial order. America wanted it nominally democratic, and the Soviets wanted outright communism. But really, they wanted the same thing, which is egalitarianism. So you get that inflicted upon Zimbabwe, where now it's not that the government is going to recognize the differences between men, whatever those differences may be. In Rhodesia's case, it was screening for prudence in the voting rolls. It's no, everyone has to be equal, even if they're equally powerless under some like genocidal tyrant like Mugabe. That's preferable to having like Ian Smith be in charge because he's a competent guy like George Washington was. And so, that's why America, Vietnam is another good example. One of the ones I go to where if you look at French Indochina, like, yes, the French beheaded some people at one point, which is what the liberals always bring up. Oh, well, look at this one picture we have of them being mean to some like bandits. But other than that, Indochina was pretty prosperous. I wouldn't have wanted to live there because I don't want to get malaria or, whatever. But it was, as far as things went, it was far better than things had been. Same with the Brooke rule of Sarawak, the White Rajas. Things were better than they had been. In Sarawak's case, the headhunters had been hunted by the Brooke family and done away with, where now people weren't like hunting each other for their heads anymore. And there's a similar thing in Indochina, where it became a civilized country because the French were willing to invest in doing that. And then World War II happens, and then France's rule is on the rocks, where in the first Indochina War, they're tenaciously trying to hold on to it. And so America, working with the Soviet Union, first, well, we'll help you out some. And so we let the French extend themselves, bleed themselves dry in the country. And then when they need it most, when just the provision of some air power could have probably rescued them at Dien Bien Phu, we yank everything from them. The support goes away, the military aid goes away. They certainly don't get the planes they need or the air power they need. And so they lose. After they lose, the country split in half with the Soviets controlling the upper half and us kind of helping in the bottom half. What do we do then? Do we strengthen the pillars of semi like reasonable rule from Saigon, where what was his name? The first president, Diem. who's a Catholic, or you could unite Catholic support in the country and work with the landowners to pacify it and get rid of the communists. No, we did the opposite of that. We killed DM so that the Catholics could be liquidated as one of the pillars of anti-communist society. And then really the remainder of American involvement was land reform, where we took land from the landowners and gave it to actual communists in the countryside. And then, so of course, the communists had their run of the country, and we left after that was over at the cost of 52,000 American dead or so, which is just a tragedy. And that's what we inflicted upon Vietnam. We gave it communism alongside the Soviets because we saw any of the alternatives, namely Catholic rule or landowner rule or some combination thereof, as immoral because it represented a hierarchy and because it wasn't egalitarian. And so that's what the post-colonial world has seen on a grand scale. It happened everywhere. Those are just Rhodesia and Indochina are two particularly good examples, but South Africa is another. And we've also seen it inside America, where it's no longer people like George Washington who are landed magnates are ruling. It's instead some combination of like corrupt officials and then just outright race communists who have used the civil rights revolution to further their power. And so America has gotten both the bureaucratic rule of Britain and the race communist rule of the post-colonial world tied together as one, which has also been a mess. So when you ask why does civilization seem to be collapsing, I think it's really the confluence of those two things, the bureaucracy and the post-colonial race communism.
Plenty of things to unwrap there, Will, and thank you for going, really in depth into that. One thing I had in my head was that you mentioned at the start there, after war, funny enough, the taxes went up. Although I mean that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, where something bad happens, and then people, we've got to pay for it. Therefore, taxes
Mhm.
become involved. So yeah, that's one takeaway I had from that. Second was that, and I'll screenshot this and put it into post as well, because you put on X a little while ago. It's a photo of Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, recently, and your comment was race communism is more destructive than a nuclear bomb. I must admit that made me laugh when I read that, but also yeah, I appreciate there's a serious element to it. I'll take, I'll either put a link to it, or I'll take a photo of it and put it in the post as well. And then I'd never thought I would mention the place Battambang in a podcast episode, which is a wonderful little place in Cambodia. And it's got a lot of French architecture. So when you were talking about Indochina over there, I never thought I'd ever have to mention Battambang in a podcast. But I'll put a link to that. I'll put a wiki travel link to that. Lovely place. I was there about 15 years ago, and yeah, so that's just me rambling on a little bit, but I think you made a lot of points there that actually what we see and what we might read and what we might know from what we have studied, actually the story is got a few more undertones than I think people think it has.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this mythos that cropped up because the Cold War was so expensive that we're fighting for liberty abroad was the message given. So when you have like 60% death taxes and 90% income taxes in America, or 90% income taxes and 90% death taxes in Britain, it's not that that's this rapacious government hoovering up everything and destroying everything that had been built for the past couple centuries in the name of like bureaucratic perversion. It's well, no, we're fighting for liberty in Cambodia. But then if you look at what happened in, any of these places involved, it's not that we were fighting for liberty. That couldn't have been cared about less. Nowhere we involved ourselves in became more free in any sense of the term. It was just overthrowing the old hierarchical order and replacing it with something more in tune with modern ideological preferences, whether that was like American style egalitarianism, which is somewhat more democratic, or Soviet egalitarianism, which is somewhat more brutal and more just dictatorial and forceful. But it didn't really matter which it was, as long as one of those came about, that was considered good, which is why the whole post-colonial world, which was this is another thing that's forgotten. Speaking of these undertones, it was still functional after World War II. Portuguese Africa, whether Mozambique and Angola, Spanish Africa, British Africa, particularly like Kenya and Rhodesia and Zambia, Nyasaland, all these places were very functional. They, in fact, were more prosperous than they were before World War II. It wasn't like London where it had been bombed. They were thriving places in this era because of the colonial rule that still was over them. Like it was that the Portuguese were managing Mozambique or ruling Mozambique that made it better. But then, because of the unique ideological circumstances of the Cold War, that was destroyed and it was replaced by the much worse option, which was like egalitarian native rule. And that's why they became dysfunctional. It wasn't the colonial governance, it was what came next, thanks to us and thanks to the Soviets, which I think people struggle to conceptualize because it goes so in the face of what they're taught in history class and what, if their grandparents fought in a war, what their grandparents thought they were fighting for. But I think it's very important to remember what actually resulted from these things, which was total dysfunction in a way that hadn't been there in any sense of the term, really since the colonial project had started to succeed in the mid 19th century.
It's funny you mentioned that because I think again, a lot of people would look at, colonialism and so forth, and, would either put their nose up, it would depend on what part of the world you're from, I guess. You would, put your nose up at it. But actually, when we're breaking it down, or when you break it down like you are doing, actually we can role reverse it and go, well, hang on a minute, actually, yeah, maybe, how it got introduced in the first place might have been a bit untoward, to say the least. But actually, when you now look at it in comparison to what's been going on more recently, actually, maybe it wasn't so bad after all.
Yeah, like the Congo is one example I go back to on this point because it's just it's such a
Yeah.
good example. Where if you read How I Found Livingston by Stanley, which is a fabulous like colonial adventure story where he went in to find this missionary and saw what the Congo was like right on the eve of colonization. It was a hellish place that was like Stone Age in every sense of the term. They had a few guns that had been given them by Europeans, but other than that they were murdering each other with like spears and rocks and eating each other and enslaving each other. And it was just the worst place on earth then existent. And it was awful. And so the Belgians settled it. A lot of what you've heard about King Leopold II is entirely made up. They say, for example, that like 10 million people were killed by this evil king who was trying to squeeze rubber from them. If you look at what actually happened, they'd been eating and killing each other before the Belgians got there. The Belgians instituted some order, and to pay for it, they had a very slight corvée labor tax in lieu of capital taxes or like payment taxes of any sort. It was just, we'll work a little bit on the rubber plantations occasionally to pay for our administration of your territory, which in most areas of the whole Congo, which is like a huge place, I think about as big as like most of Europe, which people don't realize, but it's massive. So the Belgians did that. They got rid of like the cannibalism and the tribal murder. And in most places, there was no issue with the rubber trees and extracting rubber. Most people were like happy to do it because they weren't being like eaten and hunted anymore. And there was a couple regions where things got a little violent because of revolts, and like 10,000 people might have died near exclusively at the hand of like native tribal troops. And that was it. That was like the only violence in King Leopold's Congo. And then it got blown entirely out of proportion by reporting that was really meant to diminish Belgian rule. Fortunately, instead of giving it up, the Belgian state took over. And this is another thing that's forgotten. The Belgian Congo, from like 1908 to 1960-ish, those 50 odd years were the best years in terms of governance the people of the Congo have ever gotten. They not only had railroads and roads, but they had justice, they had schools, they had hospitals, they had nuns there to proselytize and monks as well, but mainly nuns. It was really a good rule, and it became such a successful country. And this is a place where not only were the natives persecuted by each other, but 1 in 3 Europeans who went there before the Belgians died just from diseases or attacks or whatever. It became under Belgian rule a place where people went on vacation because it was so nice. It was a jewel of colonial Africa. It was not only beautiful, but successful, safe, prosperous. And then they gave all that up because America and the Soviets forced them to through the UN. And then now it's once again what it was like when Livingston and Stanley found it, which is just an unspeakably awful place in every way. And so you get these reports where Western journalists will go to the Congo and say, well, what do you think about how Kinshasa is now? And they'll say, well, it's terrible. When are the Belgians coming back? Because they were way better. And it's just this repeat occurrence where they'll always ask, when are the Belgians coming back? Because the actual people of the Congo, other than the kleptocratic class in charge, would much prefer the Belgians to what they have now. But that's just so against Western sensibilities in the present that it's you're not allowed to say that. But I think it's important to say because they'd much prefer it. It was better for everyone involved. So I find it quite sad that these ideological quibbles have led to just the destruction of continents.
Well, we've touched upon yeah, French Indochina, Vietnam, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa. Actually, I've got to ask you on South Africa because a lot's going on there at the moment. And then,
Mhm.
of course, I like to call it Doctor Congo, but yes, the Congo. I didn't know that about Belgium. I'm going to have to reread that because you've just helped me shape what I thought I knew about Belgium and the Congo. So thank you for that. I agree with what you're saying. I think that because of various ideologies and so forth, we're almost rewriting history doing this podcast, which is fascinating. South Africa, a lot going on there again at the moment, and I'm taking that position of looking at metals mining and
Mhm.
that sort of stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of socio-economic challenges. Yeah, that's an understatement, isn't it? What what has happened there? What is going on there? What is likely to happen moving forward, in your opinion?
Yeah, so before I start, I forgot to mention this with the Congo, just one source that people might find helpful. It's a book called The Case for Colonialism by Professor Bruce Gilley. I forget where he teaches, but he's a historian. It's not a great book, but part two of it, where he goes through case by case these supposed examples of colonial cruelty, is a fabulous section. It's about 100 pages long. The book you should be able to find for very cheap, where you can just read the one section, but it's fabulous, and he explains what actually happened in the Congo with a lot of, primary sources and statistical evidence for what he's describing, where he proves it to be the case. And I just did an article on the book that came out today for people who just want a quick run through of it.
Mhm.
But sorry to promote myself and promote the book, but to
Mhm.
to move just because people might find it helpful because it's a book people really don't know about, but is a very helpful one. But to move to South Africa, you really get the same thing you got in the Congo. Admittedly, they had apartheid, which was different than most of colonial Africa in that it was an explicitly racial system
Mhm.
rather than just like letting the Europeans do most things because they're more competent while also trying to boost native domestic human capital, which is more what you got in like Rhodesia and the Congo, where it's a informal system with kind of the same outcome, but a lot less harsh or less really in your face in the way that South Africa was. But regardless, South Africa was a thriving country for blacks and whites alike under apartheid. If you read books like Three Sips of Gin by Tim Bax, where he went to South Africa after Rhodesia fell, you don't get the sense that it's a struggling country. Like, yes, it was poorer than, say, some parts of America were at the time, but no one was starving. There was electrical power, there was clean drinking water, there were functional hospitals, there was domestic investment and reinvestment in functional businesses that provided jobs for people, white and black. The South African military was probably the best in the continent after Rhodesia fell and held off communism in Angola. It was just a functional country and it worked really well. And as President Reagan noted, and I'm not a huge Reagan fan, but he was good on the South Africa issue. He was talking about it in a like speech in the early 1980s when Congress was trying to foist sanctions on South Africa. And he made the point that, apartheid at that point was mainly a nominal system where if you were a competent person, you would do fine in South Africa. And it wasn't harsh. And because of it, they had like roads and hospitals, and the country wasn't like the Congo. It's a pretty good speech. And that's really what South Africa was. But much like Rhodesia, much like the Congo, that was considered just unspeakably awful in the era of democracy. And so South Africa had to be destroyed and replaced with something democratic. That's where you get like George Soros, the Open Society Foundation. Its first place
Mhm.
it set up shop was South Africa. It's another thing to keep in mind. Like he wants to turn everywhere into South Africa, as shown by him literally turning South Africa into South Africa. And so the political pressures, both via sanctions that increased inflation, the grinding war in Angola, the just general international opprobrium foisted on South Africans that made it kind of difficult for them to live normal lives or travel to Europe, see their families, stuff like that. They fell and they gave the country over to Mandela, which this is another thing where the narrative is entirely false in every way. You're told that Mandela was this like peaceful grandpa who wanted South Africa to like sing Kumbaya or whatever, like in
Mhm.
that stupid movie Invictus. It's just insanely incorrect. Mandela was a communist terrorist who, alongside a Lithuanian Soviet-trained terrorist named Joe Slovo, founded the Spear of the Nation terror group. The abbreviation in South African is MK. They bombed civilian infrastructure. Mandela was imprisoned for that. While he was in prison, through sending out messages via his wife Winnie, whose hobby was lighting people on fire, he taught MK how to continue attacking white civilians, which, if you look at the terror bombing campaign of the 70s and 80s, a lot of those attacks where MK got Mandela's like instructions on how to do it and how to handle the tactics and how to bomb places. So like the Church Street bombing, where you get dozens of dead, hundreds of wounded, that's Mandela's legacy, were these terror attacks. He never renounced violence. He was told he could be released from prison if he just wouldn't like lead terror attacks anymore, and he refused to agree to that. And so he stayed in prison until the 90s because of that. But then you get all the Western pressure, the sanctions, the embargo, all that. Mandela's released. He becomes president of the country. He was not a uniting figure. Instead, he purged like all the white people from the military and instituted the basis for Black economic empowerment laws, which, if you think about any DEI policy you've heard of or affirmative action policy you've heard of or like government grant for Blacks, imagine that times like 1,000. Just the worst way it could possibly be carried out and the most tyrannical way in which it could make your life worse is effectively how BEE has worked in South Africa since Mandela laid the groundwork for it. However, because sanctions were lifted and investment was poured into the so-called Rainbow Nation, things in South Africa are okay for like 10 years after Mandela takes over. So into the early 2000s-ish, things are still kind of okay. But then everything starts breaking down as his ANC, which was also backed in terms of funding and training and all that by the Soviets and Americans. Things get worse. Infrastructure starts degrading. Corrupt people are put in charge who just loot the country instead of maintaining it. Because of Black economic empowerment, shares of companies, like whole just stakes and ownership, have to be handed to random Blacks, most of whom are involved in the leadership of the ANC. And so the country starts degrading, and you really start seeing that in terms of crime, because the police who would be dealing with it are either too corrupt or too incompetent because of these BE laws to deal with it. So the murder rate goes way up, the property crime goes way up. You start getting just a fleeing from a lot of the cities like Johannesburg or Durban that used to be really pretty, just gorgeous, functional cities, and now they're like St. Louis or East St. Louis, and that like if you live there, you probably are going to die. With except for like a couple neighborhoods that are heavily protected by a well-armed private security. So really like the Western Cape now is the one region that's like semi-functional and the rest of the country is close to Mad Max. And that's how things progressed from the like mid 2000s to now, where crime keeps going up, general dysfunction keeps going up. And just as a couple examples to show that, because it's hard to describe the like chaotic and terrible nature of this, there are 7-to-1 welfare grantees to taxpayers in South Africa. If you look at the nominal numbers, it's closer to 4-to-1, but if you look at net taxpayers, it's essentially 7-to-1. So if you imagine being, as you are, listener, in your life, imagine your tax dollars having to support 7 other people who do nothing at all in life and instead just like commit crime. That's the economic situation in South Africa because it's so dysfunctional. Youth employment is getting close to 50%. I think it's over 40% at this point. So the country doesn't function economically anymore. BEE has made it impossible. One additional point on that, if you look at their main power provider, it was about to have to fire a few thousand experienced white engineers to hire Blacks who had never worked in the power industry before because of the race laws making it hard to employ white people. So the country doesn't function economically. If you look at crime, there's a farm murder every week, a farm attack every day, a rape every couple seconds. It is a more violent country, homicide per capita wise, than Somalia, where Somalia literally has a stock market for pirate ships. And that is a less dangerous place than South Africa. Um, it's insane. They have armed gangs that take over abandoned mines and mine them as armed militias that have like rocket launchers and machine guns. Terrorists come to South Africa to train because it's so chaotic. It's a dysfunctional country at this point, and that's really the legacy of Mandela because everything that's happened has happened on the back of what he started. So that was bad enough. That was the situation circa 2024, where someone's being raped every couple seconds, someone's being murdered every few minutes.
Mhm.
Hell. Um, Now in addition to that, the country has decided to go full Zimbabwe. Never go full Zimbabwe. If you look at how Mugabe destroyed the country circa 2000-ish, late 90s to mid 2000s, so kind of the time Mandela was taking over, he allowed the former soldiers in his terror outfit to just take over white farms. First, it was informal. Then, because of a Zimbabwean Supreme Court ruling, it became a formal thing where they could just take white farms without compensation. By 2013, there wasn't a single white farm left in the country. If you look at what happened, Rhodesia and early Zimbabwe had been the breadbasket of Africa because of all the grain they produced. They also produced other exports like tobacco, some rare minerals like groups in the metals in the palladium group, if I remember right, chromium. All that crashed. Tobacco production kind of went to zero for a while. It's kind of back up now. Grain production fell by between 60 and 70%. So the country started starving. What had been a vast grain exporter started starving. And it was because of this racial expropriation laws that just allowed white farms to be taken over either by the government or by private parties. And that was race communism. And Zimbabwe became a hellhole because of it. South Africa, as of late 2024, and then with laws enacted at the beginning of this year, did essentially that. The government changed the constitution to allow for confiscation without compensation or expropriation without compensation, where it used to be under the South African Constitution that if land was expropriated via eminent domain, like we have in America, the government had to pay market price, which is what Zimbabwe originally had as well. They then changed the Constitution to in cases where land is expropriated for reasons of racial economic equity, so taking land from whites, essentially, there does
Mhm.
not have to be compensation, so the government can take it without paying, which I don't think they've actually begun that yet, but now it's technically legal, and that will destroy the country in the same way that Zimbabwe was destroyed, where it will go from being a hellhole to actually non-functional. Because if you look at like the relative productivity statistics of white South African farmers versus black South African farmers, the expectation is you would get the same like 70%-ish fall in grain production alone. The problem is Rhodesia was doing that starting from being like a huge exporter that was very functional as an agricultural country. So a 70% fall was a disaster, but people still were kind of fed and they could import grain from other places like South Africa. South Africa now is not that. People are already food insecure. Like around a third of the country, they don't make enough food. So a 70% fall would be actual famine as opposed to like kind of something close to famine in a country that's the one functional, semi-functional country left south of the Sahara, other than Botswana. So it would be a disaster. The country would starve probably. Whatever still exists would probably be destroyed, is the best way to put it. So South Africa is on the precipice and has been pushed there by people following in Mandela's legacy.
Wow, is all I can say to that. Again, something that I have never thought of at all. So you certainly helped to reshape my thinking. Yeah, apologies, if people are watching. I'm putting all these sorts of funny faces. It's my thinking face. I'm certainly learning a lot from there as well. So never go full Zimbabwe. And in the case of South Africa, they are going slash have gone full Zimbabwe. So I think we know how that's going to end up, and it's not going to be very
Right.
pleasant at all. I appreciate we've touched upon a lot of different subjects and a lot of different countries thus far. Is there any other very prominent, or are there any other very prominent examples that we haven't yet spoken about that you would like to speak about?
Those are probably the best ones. I'll touch on one more thing. The example of how this has played out in American life, where you get the bureaucratic tyranny and the race communist tyranny. And that's disparate impact law, where ever since the case Griggs v. Duke Power, where Duke Power had been essentially using like IQ tests or IQ test type things to test prospective employees, where instead of like, say, requiring a college degree for a position, they just let you take this test. And if you seemed reasonably smart, then they figured you could probably figure out how to work at a power company and they'd consider employing you and you might get the job. A black guy sued because blacks did worse on the intelligence test than whites, which is a common occurrence. And the Supreme Court ruled that, well, yeah, that's racist. That goes against the Civil Rights Act. It's illegal to perform any sort of test that has a disparate impact, which means it disfavors a protected group, namely a racial minority, and means that they won't get the job in the way that a non-protected class would, even if the test is not meant to be a discriminatory test, and nothing in it is overtly discriminatory. So even if it's a fair test, if one group does worse than another, it is not only de facto illegal, but de facto against civil rights law, which or prima facie against civil rights law, which means you can be sued into oblivion if you have any of these tests. So then the Supreme Court backtracked a little bit, but then either under Reagan or H.W. Bush, Congress passed a law that essentially enshrined the Griggs v. Duke Power case ruling as the past like law of the land in America, where that's essentially the condition now. It's not much different from the case itself, from what was ruled in the case, despite Supreme Court rulings around it. So in America, if you're an employer and you're of a size where you have to abide by the Civil Rights Act, which I think is like over 15 employees or 50 employees, that is the law where anything you do, whether it's hiring people or firing people or promoting people, if what you do affects racial minorities in a way that it doesn't affect whites, then you can be sued. One example of this is Equinox Gym. There was a black woman they employed who was late to work like 50 times. They fired her because she was late to work 50 times, and you can't run a business if people are late. The court found this went, I think, all the way to the Supreme Court. It found that that was, in fact, a disparate impact outcome because white people show up to work on time or more likely to. And so, in firing the black woman who didn't show up to work on time, they had acted in a racist manner. And she won like $11 million or something insane. So that is the state of law in America. And it doesn't just apply to economic life. It applies to college admissions.
Mm.
It applies to standardized testing. It even applies to discipline inside schools. So if you look at like why urban schools are so dangerous for white kids, it's because if blacks are bullying white kids, the school is forbidden by law from disciplining them, because that would mean that whites are disciplined at a lesser rate than blacks. And so it's illegal. So, like, when you get that kid, Jonathan something, who was literally stomped to death by black classmates, the school had to let that condition happen because to stop them from killing him would have been a disparate impact outcome, and the school would have been held accountable under civil rights law. So
Wow.
that is the state of like they could have restrained the kids. I'm exaggerating somewhat, but they had to let the violent bullying persist to the point where that happened because to do otherwise would have been against civil rights law. So when you consider anything happening in America, it should be viewed through that lens. We really have like a Reconstruction style government that's just harsh in all the worst ways, or a post-colonial government that's tyrannical in all the worst ways, where to do anything sane, like to stop bullies from bullying kids, to promote people who deserve to be promoted, to hire people who deserve to be hired without using some very expensive nominal gap filler like college degrees, which have really become important because of the Griggs case. That is legal. You will be fined. You will be dragged before courts and have all your assets stripped from you. So no one does it. And that's why things are dysfunctional. That's why America is turning into South Africa, because it would be quite literally illegal to do otherwise.
Wow, okay. So if the USA is turning into South Africa and South Africa has turned into full Zimbabwe, then watch out below, I think, is
Yeah.
is probably how I would summarize that.
Yeah, not good.
No,
But
no,
yeah.
definitely not. Well, Will, I think it's been we started off pretty much in the USA and we've actually finished up there in the USA, even though we've gone back, for various points in history. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think that there is a lot for people to learn, and I think importantly, what I would say is that if you believe something, then try and question why you have that belief, i.e., going back to the Congo, I say I've learned a lot there that I'm going to have to go away and study just to try and get the truth, because what I thought and what you said are two different things. And I'm not saying that one's a lie and one's not. I've got a lot of homework to do, basically.
Mm.
So I'd urge people, listeners, to do the same. Always question why you think something and why you have a belief system, and then challenge that belief system, just like I'm going to go away and do after we finish recording. It'd be great to have you back for another conversation in due course. Actually, I might try and reach out to yourself and EM to have a three-way
Absolutely.
conversation because I think that would be absolutely fantastic.
Definitely.
Mentioned mentioned at the start. I always like to give people the opportunity to explain a bit more about their work and how they can be found. So if people wanted to connect with you, get hold of you, please do let us know. And I will say that what you mentioned, the links, etc., I'll put into the show notes on YouTube and Substack.
Great. Thank you.
How do people get in touch?
Oh,
We've got the
sorry.
No Contribute on Substack and X.
Yeah, sorry, misunderstood. Yeah, so you can find me on an X. I'm Will Tanner at Will underscore Tanner underscore one. If you want to reach out, that's probably the best way to do so because I check X DMs relatively frequently and post most of my work there. If you're interested in my thoughts in long form, I do a podcast called The Old World that you should be able to find on whatever platform and a Substack called The American Tribune. You should just be able to look up the American Tribune Substack and it'll pop up. And I mainly focus on what we talked about here, like the colonial world and the rule by Gentry and the things related to it. So check it out. You should find it interesting. And if you're interested in a short form discussion of the Congo, I didn't write this, but it's quite good. It's called King Hochschild's Hoax on the American Conservative. It's pretty short, but it's a information-packed article, much shorter than Gilly's book I was discussing earlier, that is very much worth reading because it will open your eyes to the lies you've been told about colonial Africa in a very like normal person friendly, easily readable way. So I'd really recommend checking it out.
Perfect. I believe I've just found that particular thing
Awesome.
as well, so I will link to that as I mentioned. It's been superb. As I said, it'd be great to have round two, and also actually a three-way conversation. I think with EM would be really beneficial as well.
Definitely.
Thank you for your time, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you a ton for having me on. Appreciate it.